when we... I mean, I totally cut you off. The fluorescent lights in here are really hurting my eyes today. I should have brought my sunglasses in so that way they didn't.
Do you want to turn them off?
What?
Do you want to turn them off? We don't need them on.
No, we're good. I don't want to talk to you in the dark. That's creepy. I mean, it always leads to other activities when we do that.
Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider.
Welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, and I love to hit record when Mason is doing goofy shit so y'all can hear it without him necessarily knowing that we are recording. Although
feels mystical,
I think...
or at least manipulative.
It is manipulative.
Manipulative.
Yeah, shut up. Okay. Yes, that's a better word to use for sure. I think you knew, though, that I hit record this time.
I was mostly aware, yeah.
So you assumed that that's what I had done, so
yes. Assumption is a good word, yeah.
Yeah, as long as you're talking, I cannot hear the sound of the Rubik's Cube that you are solving in the background.
Okay, then.
So Mason is a...
So less shutting up time for me today. I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah, how important is it to you to solve that Rubik's Cube?
Oh, not at all.
How fast can you do it nowadays?
I don't know. Less than 2 minutes for sure.
Less than 2 minutes. What's your fastest time ever?
About a minute, but it was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, like when you were young and had a million things that you could ignore without life exploding in front of you.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Mostly I was a missionary. So just on downtime, I would just practice and...
I'm sorry. That's hilarious. When I had all this downtime on my mission. So Mason gained on his mission the ability to solve a Rubik's Cube in less than a minute. That's pretty awesome. I bet it was a great conversation breaker. Like,
always is.
It is.
Yep, always is.
Yeah, to this day as well. So welcome back. We are going to be talking today about mystical manipulation. We're going to be defining what that is. And we're going to really talk about how to stay in a reality-based thinking pattern utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy skills to challenge that. Now, one of the things that Mason and I in our planning meeting talked about is that we feel like we want to let our listeners know a little bit about what's going on in my medical health life, just because you're probably going to see some of these symptoms showing up on our podcast until I'm back in remission. So I have a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. I'm very blessed in the sense that I only have one lesion on my brain. And so the indication there is that the demyelination of my nerves has not gotten so severe that it is impeding my functioning the way that it could for most people who have multiple sclerosis at the age of 42, the way that I do. So I would say most people have somewhere between 50 and hundreds of lesions. So for me, I've been diagnosed. I got my very first diagnosis around, I want to say 2013, 14. No, it was when we went back to North Carolina the second time. So 2014, 2015 was when I was initially diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and that was after my first huge flare-up. I ended up having to use a walker to walk for, a couple of months until the flare. Yeah, they put me on some really high steroids, and then I was able to regain my ability. Like my feet they were not getting the signal that I was shifting my weight, and so I fell quite a bit. And that's when I got my initial diagnoses. And then I went, because of the military, we moved a lot. I went all of these, oh yes, you have multiple sclerosis. No, you don't. You only have one lesion. And I have been re-diagnosed with MS, I think 3 or 4 times now since 2014, 2015, when I got my first diagnosis. But it's no longer a back and forth I've had 5. I think this is my 5th episode of flare-up. And so the way that my MS presents the most is with recurring episodes of optic neuritis. So about almost 2 weeks now, 2 weeks ago now, I had my MRI. And from the MRI brain scan perspective, everything looked good. And the neurologist was like, great, looks like you're still in remission. Keep shooting yourself up once a month with Kesimpta. And, I'll see you again in October for your next full-blown scans and exams and blah, 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 blah. But this last, Thursday for me. So by the time you hear this, it will have been almost 6 weeks, because I think we're about 6 weeks ahead right now in our recording. But anyway, I went to my doctor at MU, which is the University Hospital. Mizzou is Missouri University in Columbia. And my doctor, Dr. Suleiman, there is a neuro-ophthalmologist, and he specializes in MS and other neurologic diseases that impact the eyes. And unfortunately, I flunked all of my tests, and I am in an active state of optic neuritis, and I'm starting to see some of those flare-ups. So some of the things that you might see here is that I lose my words more often than normal. I have a really hard time. It's like temporary amnesia almost, where I'll be speaking and all of a sudden I can't remember what I was saying, but it doesn't come back to me. I can't find the vocabulary words that I'm looking for more so than normal. And it's actually, I think it's been showing up for the last couple of weeks, actually, Mason, more so than, but I just thought it was the normal, oh, I'm tired, it's no big deal. So knowing that I'm in active flare, I'm like, oh yeah, becoming more aware of what that is. That could be cognitive bias, couldn't it? I lost my word. Oh, it's because I'm in MS flare. So anyway, I'm in an active flare. And the challenge is because I don't know when it started. I've missed my window for the heavy dose of steroids. And as long as I don't lose my vision, it's really just a matter of waiting this out. Now, if I start to lose my vision, then my course of treatment definitely changes. I've only had that happen once. Gratefully, my vision came back. But there are 2 Masons right now. I definitely have some double vision. And the good news is that there's 2 Masons instead of 2 Sarahs, because 2 Masons is way more tolerable than 2 Sarahs. So
not to me.
So anyway, if I'm losing my train of thought or stumbling, please know that it's hard for me. And that's what's going on. We would love it if you send good vibes, well wishes, or you can curse me. That's fine too. If that's kind of your MO, that's fine. But just wanted to let you know, if I'm having a difficult time with communicating right now, that's what's going on. It definitely makes what I do for a living a little bit more complicated. When I start losing my train of thought. So far, my clients have been really understanding, though. I'm really blessed there. So anyway, all right.
Well, on that note,
yeah, you won't be able to see the shocks or shivers or tremors that I get. That I get to keep private until my live shows. But all righty. So we are talking about mystical manipulation today, and Mason and I felt like probably the first step that we needed to do was to define what the word mystical means in the dictionary. Because one of the things that I think we've talked about in the past, have we talked about loading the language? Because we said last week we were going to start with meniscopal. MS. Mystical. Just kidding. Squirrel. Mystical manipulation. We were going to pick something up that we recorded last week. Do you remember what that was, hon? Uh-oh, he's looking. I remember. See, it's not the MS. I'm fine. We were going to talk about your conversation with your brother and identify how he was utilizing mystical manipulation to shame you So we're gonna definitely come back and talk about that.
Okay.
As well.
Can't wait.
All right. So Mason, what does mystical mean?
All right. So according to Webster, let's see here. The first definition, having a spiritual meaning or reality that is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intelligence.
Okay. So we're talking about a spiritual experience.
Well, right. And it just simply says having a spiritual meaning or reality.
Oh, meaning or reality. Got it.
That is not apparent to the senses or obvious to the intelligence. So it's completely separated from what you would expect as a logical progression of a reality.
Right. So Mason had asked me, when we were starting this, this was before you read it out of the book. What does mystical manipulation mean? And so, we reviewed that this morning when we were driving over here. And we talked about that mystical manipulation is the phenomenon where somebody uses an existential belief system and then they create a fear of loss or fear of judgment or fear of something within that system to control the thoughts, actions, behaviors, emotions of the people over which they are trying to manipulate. So right. This is, it's going to be, things like, Mason, in that text message that we're going to kind of tear apart from your brother, or those communications that you had with your family, really common things that would be considered mystical manipulation is statements like you're throwing your eternal salvation away, or your children, when your dad said your children are going to suffer because you've left Mormonism. Those are statements of mystical manipulation. And I think it's important to point out, and I'm going to take this really quickly from the Recovering Agency book that Lindsey Corbden wrote. Remember, we are definitely promoting that you buy this for yourself because we are barely scratching the surface of some of the things that Lindsey has written about in here because this is such a valuable resource book. But one of the things that really stood out to me in the mystical manipulation chapter is on page 127. And Mason, this is that really long paragraph that you had said. I'm going to read the opening line and the closing line. So this is going to be the fourth paragraph down on page 127 in Recovering Agency, Lifting the Veil of Mormon Mind Control by Lindsey Corbden. And what they said is the manipulation may not be entirely intentional and may arise naturally given the environment. And that's what when your dad says things to you, Mason, like your children are going to suffer, I don't think he's intentionally trying to control you. I think that it's the environment of that high demand religion has made him feel like by reminding you of this existential loss that he's doing you a favor, that he's trying to pull you back into something that is safer because his existential belief is that Mormonism is the one and only way to be with your family forever.
Yeah. Well, and you said you wanted to go to the end here, but let me just pull one other line here. Almost the next line. This is quoting Lifton in Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Ideological totalists do not pursue this approach solely for the purpose of maintaining a sense of power over others. Rather, they are impelled by a special kind of mystique which not only justifies such manipulations, but makes them mandatory.
Right.
And I think it's just, this whole cult series has been not about trying to tag anybody with a name or anything like that. Like, we're not trying to call any particular religion a cult or any particular organization a cult. It's about recognizing what kind of things happen in cult-like organizations so that you can be aware of what's going on, more cognizant of those things, so that you can then protect yourself from manipulation that you don't want as a part of your life.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the challenges is because this is an existential existence. One of the things that a lot of high demand religions will do is with that mysticism is they will define what happens after this life here on earth.
Right.
So this life is tangible. We are here because we are living in it. I know that rocks are real.
Right.
I can touch them. I can feel them. I can pick them up. I can smash them.
Right. We have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen or what things can happen in this tangible universe because of the experiences of ourselves and other people.
Right. And, we can even identify and define things that we cannot see in this world because of other things that we can see. So something like gravity. I know that gravity exists because when I drop something, it always hits the ground.
Right.
If I hold my hand out and I drop it, no matter what way my palm is facing, it's going to eventually come down. And so I have scientific, tangible evidence that can be verified by anybody else conducting the same experiment that gravity is a real force. When we're talking about existential things, there's no way to prove it, and I would say that, our human brain craves mysticism. It craves wonder. It craves magical things. That's normal, but it doesn't mean that those things are real in reality. And when I'm talking about reality, I'm talking about the kind of reality that is tangibly observable, repeatable, like that scientific reality. Right. There is no way in this life for me to know that there is a God. However, I believe that there is something bigger than myself that is divine or God-like. But I have to be able to say, talk about the difference between I know and I believe, or I know and I think. And so one of the challenges that comes with these cult-like systems is they talk about this existential thing and they treat it as if it is reality, as if it is factual reality that cannot be disputed no matter what. Hey, head on over to Amazon and buy your copy of Trauma Bonded, a true story of navigating attachments forged in complex PTSD by me, Sarah Westbrook.
Yeah, well, then I'm going to challenge just one thing that you said there. You said that there's no way that I
stop.
can know. I know.
Whoa.
I know.
I can challenge you. You are not allowed to challenge me back. That is our reality.
All right, I guess we're done with this one.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you next time. Bye.
Go ahead, I'm going to challenge one thing that you said. You said that there's no way that I can know that God exists. And I don't think that that is true. I think that there are ways. For instance, if God does exist in whatever form he, she, whatever exists, there are ways to know that. But there's not a scientifically consistent and provable way for that. For instance, God could show up at your doorstep and say, hey, I'm God, and give all kinds of signs that he is what he says he is, or she is what she says she is. And for you, that would be an absolute proof that God exists. But the likelihood that that will happen is low, and the likelihood that that will happen for everybody in the same way is I guess I would say impossible. Whereas when it comes to scientific evidence, the way that we understand how science works is we do something and it is repeatable. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that there's no way you can know that God exists. It's just that there is not a tangible way that the earth can know. If a scientist here in the Americas says there's this here bacteria that does this, and a scientist in Russia and a scientist in China want to know the same thing, they follow the same process and they will learn the same thing because it is a tangible existence. But if I say I want to know that God exists, and so I decide I'm going to, in my case, I'm going to kneel down and pray and I'm going to ask God to show himself to me, fine, maybe that works for me, but for somebody in Russia, somebody in China, somebody in Africa, the process isn't repeatable in the same way because we all have a different mystical experience.
So I'm going to push back and poke holes in you a little bit because that's how I roll, and gratefully you love me for it. I don't think that even if I have a personal experience with God, a mystical experience with God, that I can comfortably, like Sarah Westbrook cannot say, I know that was God, because it's not repeatable for other people. I mean, honestly, Houdini could show up at my door, claim that he is God, and do all kinds of really cool tricks that I would perceive as magical and mysterious. Right. And I wouldn't be able to understand how he got the ball to move from there to there, or how he cut the person in half and there's no blood and then put them back together right before my eyes. Like, there are things in our brain, I think about like Brig and the bugs that he used to pick off of his skin. There were no bugs. But you would not have been able to convince Brig of that because his brain created something that was not there, but he was convinced they were there. That's part of like that schizophrenia. And so, but where I agree with you is that when we have mystical experiences, I believe that those are meant for you and your personal spiritual growth and connection to however you identify the divine. And one of the things where I can say that mysticism is verified in science is we've got lots of examples where the value of mysticism is very obvious in science. So things like, we know that prayer is healing and calming and can reduce anxiety and can bring feelings of peace. Right. We can repeat that in the scientific studies over and over again. I just did an episode, I believe it's episode 153. Mason, can you check that? It's on the Almost Awakened podcast thing. I think it's episode 153. We'll leave a link to that.
It'll be in the notes, yeah.
Yeah, we'll leave a link to it in the notes. But I just did a guest appearance on the Almost Awakened podcast where we talked about the clinical, a clinical perspective on spirituality and psychedelics. And when we look at the research and the science of how psychedelics work for healing PTSD and anxiety and depression and addiction issues, the one thing that is consistent in those studies is that the person has to have a mystical experience in order to experience the reduction in hypervigilance and flashbacks and nervousness and depression. And the mystical experience appears to be the mechanism of action. So I don't want to diminish the value of a mystical experience. What I want to advocate for is me, Sarah Westbrook, my mystical experiences are meant for me and me alone. They are not meant for me to then project as truth for Mason Westbrook or for our children. Now, I can absolutely share them with you and say, this is what I learned on this journey, and you might be able to benefit from my sharing that. But as soon as I say something along the lines of, I had this experience and God told me, Mason, that you need to, I've crossed a line of undue influence. Go ahead.
Well, and I think that's where we need to just kind of recognize the, I had the right word and now it's gone.
Do you have MS?
The areas in which, oh goodness gracious, I cannot remember the word now. If you're doing a comparison of mysticism with science, the scientific evidence is repeatable. With mysticism, the limitations, that's the word I was looking for. So if you're aware of the limitations of a mystical outlook on life, you're less likely to be manipulated by those who use mystical experiences. Basically meaning that if you recognize, hey, my spiritual experiences are for me, And that therefore means that his mystical experiences are for him and so on, she, he, whatever.
Right.
The mystical experiences are a more personal thing, then you're less likely to be manipulated by somebody else's mystical experiences. And that's really all that this is. It's not about minimizing mysticism, because you're right. There's lots of research that demonstrates how a mystical or spiritual outlook on life is beneficial to our health and to all kinds of things in our lives. And so I agree. I don't want to minimize that at all. I just want us to be able to look and recognize the limitations of this so that I don't allow myself to be manipulated by it. The very first paragraph in this section, mystical manipulation, says
page
this.
126.
Says mystical manipulation establishes a sense of higher purpose where the ends can justify any means. Forces exist which are more powerful than the self. Therefore, the self must adapt at all costs. In fact, the self has no choice but to adapt. That's the manipulation part. I've taken something that is beautiful.
Pause. Read that last sentence. Miracles, or I'm going to read it for you. Mason, you read it. Here, let me just do it for you. I'm a brat. Miracles may be orchestrated, or at the very least, ordinary events come to be seen as proof of the group's reality.
Right. It's this idea that because I have made the mystical more important or allowed somebody else to make the mystical more important in my life, I have set myself up to be manipulated by it.
Right.
And so if I decide to be a member of a church that is mystical, like Mormonism, fine, right? It can be a great benefit in my life. Lots of people benefit greatly from being involved in Mormonism or any number of religions. But if I don't recognize how some of what is going on is manipulative, then I might find myself stuck in a situation that I did not plan on, that I was not okay with. And now I'm left really, like for me, in my own personal experience, when I finally said, hey, I'm done with this, that was 45 years of my life. I've given so much of who I am if I allow the mysticism of any organization to become a means for manipulation. I'm going to find myself less able to walk away. Less able to make the choices that I want to make, whether or not they're right or wrong. I'm not talking about right or wrong or not. Mormonism might be exactly what it says that it is. That's not the point.
Okay, keep going.
The point is I want to make the decisions that I want to make for my life without being manipulated by another organization to do something different.
Well, and I think it's important, if we go back to that longer paragraph on page 127, the very last sentence there says, similarly, and this is again Lindsey Corbden, they say, similarly, any thought or action which questions the higher purpose is considered to be stimulated by a lower purpose, to be backward, selfish, and petty in the face of the great overriding mission. And really where I see the problem in organized religion in general is that you have a person who is special in some way. So like in Mormonism, it's Joseph Smith was special because he had a vision and he saw God. Pastors, preachers, priests, they're going to be quote unquote special because they're the church leader. They're a spiritual leader. They went to seminary school or they went to Christian college and all of these things. So they know more than me. They're my spiritual leader in some realm. But those individuals take that position of power and say, this is how I'm interpreting the spiritual experiences for everybody else.
Yes.
And that's really where the issue is, because I have a colleague here in Missouri who identifies as a spiritual leader. They do not have any mental health training. They're not a life coach. They give their services, their mentorship services, and it's a paid service. That's their business. And they state that they are a spiritual leader. And as I've had interactions with this individual on a professional level, because there's some mutual clients. I'm really impressed by this woman because she says she's a spiritual leader, but what she does is she asks insightful questions so that the person that she is mentoring is thinking about their own spiritual experiences in new ways. And that I feel is really healthy. And so like one of the things that I've experienced in leaving Mormonism is when I start to think critically or point out some of the icky Joseph Smith facts, the defenses that go up about Joseph Smith are really concerning. Like the things, it is fact. And even Mormons who are reading their own Mormon church history are going to recognize that it is fact that Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl and that he married multiple teenagers when he was in his 30s. For me, that's icky no matter how you slice it.
Right.
But because if we start to question and poke holes in Joseph Smith's character, he loses credibility. And if Joseph Smith loses credibility in Mormonism, suddenly the existential beliefs go into crisis. Because if Joseph Smith did not have the vision, then the church is not true. And that's terrifying.
At the very least, it's not what it claims to be.
Right. And what that creates is what we call in my field an existential crisis.
Right.
In layman's terms, what you hear a lot on like Mormonism's Live or Mormon Stories is a crisis of faith. They are basically the same thing in that when you join this Mormon church, you give up your own authenticity and sovereignty over your spiritual experiences.
Right.
Because one of the things, and Mason, I think there was a quote on this. I don't remember if we marked it down, but let's see. Yeah, it's right here. So on page 130, again, Luna Lindsey says, Mormons have been conditioned towards magical thinking, which Wikipedia defines as the identification of causal relationships between actions and events where scientific consensus says that there is none, or even when there is direct evidence to the contrary. And then later down, Luna quotes, is this Bruce R. McConkie that basically says, you can have a spiritual experience, but if your spiritual experience goes against what the leaders of the church say, well, now it's Satan. And you don't have authenticity. You don't have, not authenticity, you don't have authority of your own experiences because most of us are bound to have an experience that is different than an organization says it should be.
Right.
And if I'm like, oh, I can't pay attention to that, mystical experience or that, there's another word that I can't remember right now. Not magical, mystic. Shit. Anyway, I'll come up with it later. There's another word that describes this type of thing. If I am going to discount every experience I have because it doesn't support the truthfulness of my church, that's a problem.
Right.
That is a sign that you are being manipulated on an existential basis because frankly, we can't prove heaven exists. Although near-death experiences, multiple of them, all seem to have some level of ascension into a bright place of peace and joy and unconditional love. And that sounds heavenly. I definitely believe that there's a heaven, but I'm not going to be able to prove it until I get there, if there is one.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I was going to add there is that actually really devalues your spiritual experiences too. If all of your spiritual experiences have to fall within a certain parameter, because that's what truth is, then that organization has devalued all of your spiritual experiences, not just the ones that don't fall in that parameter. They devalue the ones that fall in that parameter because of course they did. Well, of course you had that experience because this is true. If you read the Book of Mormon and you came to know for yourself via the Holy Ghost that it is true, even that is devalued because of course you did, because
Right.
the Book of Mormon is true. And so this organization has devalued all your spiritual experiences, and they've taken away your authority to control your own spiritual path.
Right.
You've given it up. But in a lot of cases, like for you and me who grew up in the church, it was kind of taken away because we didn't have any idea that that was going on. It was stolen from us because this is just how we were taught. This is how it works.
Well, and it was stolen from us from a place of good intentions to keep
Sure.
us on the straight and narrow so that we would have a happy existence in the existential place of the celestial kingdom and hopefully the highest degree of glory within the celestial
Right.
kingdom. But I've got to do all of these tasks. And yeah,
Right. The
it becomes
ends
a problem.
justify any means.
Right. And what Luna says again on page 126 under mystical manipulation, they quote the Yanya Lalich and Tobias in Captive Hearts. And so Luna says Captive Hearts calls it a quote unquote claim of authority, divine, supernatural, or otherwise, which allows for the rationale that the ends justify the means since the end is directed by a higher purpose. And I'm going to end that quote there, even though it goes on in the book. But the reason that we chose to talk about this today is because as Mason has left the church, so when I left Mormonism, my family was pretty much crickets on the Mormon stuff because the majority of my extended family is already out. Like there's very few active members on my side of the family. So my dad's side of the family, there were only ever a few members in the church anyway, because my grandma was not an active member of the church, and neither was my grandpa. My grandpa Lee was atheist, and my grandma Hanson went inactive when my dad was very young. And so most of my uncles and aunts on that side were either very casual about it or not members at all. So it's just not a issue on my Lee side of the family. And then on my Trask side of the family, the majority of my cousins are out. The majority of my aunts and uncles are out. Like there's very few members.
So let's take a quick commercial break. Unpacking Mormonism. We'll be right back.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
And so my family has a lot of experience of what not to say.
Right.
When
It's not a new
somebody
thing for
leaves,
them.
it's not a new thing. And so when I left, it wasn't a big deal for my family. I mean, I know that my mom grieved. I know that she was sad about it, but I didn't have the familial experiences on the topic of leaving the church that Mason is having. And one of the things that's really interesting is that your brother, who you've ended up blocking, has said a number of times that he feels like he's defending God, and that the ends justify the means. He's allowed to say really shitty, hurtful, toxic, gaslighting, aggressive things because he's protecting the divine. And Mason, it's all your fault that the family is in upheaval right now because you are basically Nephi who stumbled in your family.
Well, let me just continue. You said you wanted to stop that quote there, but I'm going to continue it.
Of course you are. Sheesh.
The person is required to subordinate himself to the group or cause and stops all questioning. For who can question the higher purpose? And I think that that's important because, again, talking about the manipulation of it is that if you can't question God, then you are a slave to whoever decides who God is for you. Mm-hmm. And if that's an organization, I'm now a slave to that organization because they've defined what existential is, what the requirements are for me to be a part of the existential, and the requirements for me to actually get back to the existential in the way that Mormonism would describe it. We're going back to God. Mm-hmm. They own my mystical experience. They own my spiritual experiences because I have allowed them to define it all and given my authority to them.
Well, and when you allow them to define it, they reinforce that with, yes, you're right. This is what your spiritual experience means because it falls in line our box. To finish out that quote, if you're going to finish it, then I'm going to finish it even better than you, is, again, quoting from Captive Hearts, is self-expression and independent action wither away. Mm-hmm. Because if you can get somebody to believe that by leaving the organization, their existential happiness is doomed, you have control over that person.
Yeah, or you can, I think the other piece of that is then as the quote-unquote faithful member, you can justify walking away from them. So if I'm going to give up my control over you, I'm also going to give up my relationship with you. I can't have a relationship where you're not controlled by the mystical.
Well, and one of the challenges is that when you give your authenticity of your spiritual self over to somebody else, you trust them implicitly.
Right.
Which blinds you from being able to see red flags. When you were talking to your dad the other day about whether or not Russell M. Nelson lied or exaggerated his near plane crash experience,
right,
your dad could not even begin to fathom that was a lie,
right,
because the prophet of God is not going to lie like that in conference. And so much so that your dad was like, well, they must not have listened to every black box. They must not have found the right report, despite the evidence that, based on Nelson's statements and the research that they did, they found the plane. It did have an issue, nothing like what Nelson described, and it landed early within the time frame that Nelson stated from those airports. Your dad, it was like, I'm not willing to even look at the credibility of this evidence because it is too existentially terrifying to think that my prophet is dishonest.
Right. And if there's no possibility that he could be lying, then there's no open conversation about the situation.
Right.
If there's no possibility that Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or Muslims or whatever organization, if there's no possibility that they could be wrong, you're completely closed off to actually understanding the truth.
Yeah. Well, and I would say it's dangerous for anybody, and I'm comfortable saying anybody, to trust somebody else implicitly.
Right.
Because we're all human. We all fuck up.
Yeah.
I love you, Mason. I love you with everything in my heart, and I don't think you would ever do anything to intentionally hurt me. However, I'm smart enough to know that life happens.
Sure.
And that the potential is always there that you would act in a way that is outside of your own held morals and values, because it happens. You're human. I don't want you to, but I do know that I trust you as much as I can trust any human. But implicit trust is dangerous.
Yeah.
Implicit trust is giving that person the ability to control you and practice undue influence, and you never question it. And anytime you stop questioning the validity of something, that's a red flag. Even if you ask scientists today, if you say, is there proof that amoxicillin kills this bacteria? Scientists will hesitate at saying, yes, this is absolute proof or absolute fact. They're going to say something along the lines of, based on my experience or based on, what I'm seeing in the microscope, it appears that amoxicillin kills this bacteria 99.9% of the time. But
right.
Guess what? 0.1%? There's always the acceptance in the scientific community that new information could change your perspective.
Yeah. Well, then I think that, I mean, you're absolutely right. To trust someone implicitly is dangerous. To trust an organization implicitly is even more dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
Because now you're dealing with all kinds of other issues. And the problem with Mormonism in particular is that they've set themselves up to be infallible.
Right.
Right. If you look back at when Wilford Woodruff, it's in the official Declaration 1, the Lord will never allow me or any other man to lead this church astray. It's not in the program. If I were to try, God would just take me from the earth. What he's done is set up an infallible organization. Right. Because God will not allow for it to be taken in the wrong direction. He won't allow it. And so now you've invited the members to trust implicitly in somebody else, and then to carry that onward in the organization that they lead.
Right.
And because one prophet said at one time, it applies to every prophet from now till the end of eternity, because it's still the same organization, it's still the same God, so on. We've given our authority and our ability to question away. Right. And then we're targeted if we do. Right. If we do question, especially if we question out loud, the people around us seek very strongly to silence us, to silence our voices.
Many of the group members absolutely do. Yes, for sure. I think that, one of the things that's really interesting is that, Wilford Woodruff says God won't allow us to lead you astray. And yet we know that President Ezra Taft Benson had severe dementia the last several years. He was the prophet. So how is he supposed to lead when he's suffering from a medical condition? It's one of those, again, let's utilize reality-based thinking to challenge mystical manipulation. And I absolutely love, so this was one of my favorite sections in Luna's book, which is one of the reasons why you're getting so many quotes from it today, because they did such a great job of describing this in a way that puts into words something that's really difficult to explain for most people, myself included. But on the middle of page 127, starting with mystical manipulation, the paragraph reads, and this is, let me look at this. Yes, this is Luna's words. Mystical manipulation is also related to the concept of cognitive distortions, which are ways in which we view reality incorrectly to fit beliefs about ourselves. This concept is used widely in cognitive behavioral therapy, not the cognitive distortions. That's not what's used in cognitive behavioral therapy. Rather, what she's about to describe is utilized in CBT. And I utilize this quite regularly in my clinic. And that is cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on transforming negative thought patterns into more truthful and beneficial beliefs. And then Luna gives the example of I'm so stupid. When we cognitively reframe or cognitively challenge that, it becomes sometimes I make mistakes, but I can do this. And so, when we look at something, a statement of fact by like Wilford Woodruff, who said, there's no way a prophet will ever be able to lead you astray because God will kill him first. But then we go, okay, what are some of the reality-based thinkings? What is the tangible, objectively factual information that I have to challenge this? Ezra Taft Benson led the church for the last several years while he had dementia, and the Lord did not remove him from the church. Gordon B. Hinckley and Thomas S. Monson kind of took things over while they waited for him to croak. Ribbit. Which is not, that does not follow the prophets, that does not follow Wilford Woodruff's statement. I know that when Nelson came out and advocated for the use of the vaccine and did so from a somewhat prophetic place, there were many anti-vaxxers out there who wondered if he was a false prophet. You know, one of the things that really aggravated me, Mason, was when Nelson reinforced the rules for the word of wisdom and he outlawed and said green tea was bad. And that was something that your mom had felt had been very beneficial to her health. And she immediately stopped drinking it because the prophet gave his word, and she didn't question. She didn't say, I wonder if he's speaking as a prophet or as a man. And that's the problem, is that if he's the prophet who's infallible, when the hell are we supposed to know, prophet or man?
Right. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to make sure I'm understanding this or kind of stating this in an appropriate way. When you talked about cognitive behavioral therapy, or Luna says, which focuses on transforming negative thought patterns into more truthful and beneficial beliefs. What you're doing is, as a therapist, trying to help this person who's struggling with negative thoughts be able to turn their attention to a more positive way of seeing themselves. I would argue that the church as an organization says that they do those things, that they're trying to make you, like, for instance, even the example with the tea and my mom, President Nelson is essentially saying, look, tea isn't good for you. You need to leave it alone. And my mom, who believes that he's a prophet, says, okay, I will. But there's not really a thought process going on in there. The problem is that Nelson gains his authority because of his control over your existential beliefs. So my mom makes the choice, I'm not drinking green tea, not because she thinks green tea is bad for her. She's making the choice, I'm not going to drink green tea because I don't want it to affect my eternal salvation, because the word of wisdom affects her temple recommend and her ability to go to the temple. So she has made, and I'm making conjecture here, this is how it feels from my perspective, she's making the choice to follow because of the effect it has on an existential belief system controlled by that organization. And that's where the unhealthy manipulation part comes in. If you don't want to drink green tea, fine, don't drink green tea. No issues there. But if you don't want to drink green tea because somebody in an organization that controls your belief about the existential world told you can't, that's not the same thing.
Right. Well, and I think it doesn't help that Nelson is a doctor. So not only is he
now he has
speaking
authority
as a prophet,
from two different places.
Now he's an authority. Whereas if you go into the literature and look at, the health benefits of certain teas.
It doesn't mean he actually has authority. It's just appears that way.
He's a heart surgeon. He does not specialize in nutrition.
Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Right.
Or metabolic things.
Not at all. If he had patients who needed to change their nutrition, he would send them to somebody who was a specialist to do it.
Another provider.
Not that he doesn't know some of that,
right.
But he recognizes he's not the expert in this. He's going to send it to somebody who does do this every single day and can give that person the kind of attention they need from a nutritional perspective.
Right. Well, and the challenge is that members become completely dependent on the organization to make their choices for them. And a lot of people within Mormonism will say, no, the Mormon Church does not make my decisions for me. But they do. They talk about who you should marry, where you should marry, what you eat, what you drink, how you interpret your own intuition, your own spiritual experiences. They tell you when you're right. They tell you when you're wrong. They tell you how to raise your family. They tell you what kind of work you should or should not get into. You become dependent on the organization to do your thinking for you. And with the mystical manipulation, it's also like I said last week, this is the bridge between thought control and emotional control, in the sense of, because they're able to manipulate how you interpret things, they also tell you how to feel about them. So if I have a spiritual experience that leads me away from Mormonism. They're going to tell me that that's Satan. And then suddenly I'm going to start self-doubting. I might feel guilty. I might feel, oh, I did something wrong because I got an answer that goes against the prophet. And now they are controlling your emotions.
Yeah, if you look at this section, emotional control, and we're going to go over this a little bit more in the next episode, but just a brief little thing. Emotional control, number 1, manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish. So now you've kind of black and whited the emotions.
Right.
Number 2, teach emotion-stopping techniques to block feelings of homesickness, anger, doubt. This is a progression. I hope you can kind of hear the progression the way that I'm hearing it. Number 3, make the person feel that problems are always their own fault, never the leader's or the group's fault. So you can't address it with the group. It's all on me. Number 4.
Well, and pause there for a minute. That's what your family is doing, because Mason is speaking out about undue influence and about some of the struggles and the negative emotions that he is experiencing in a public forum. Now you are, in your brother's words, inciting war against the church.
Right.
Or,
right.
I'm sorry, not inciting, declaring. You declared war against the church. And it's your fault that you're not going to have familial relationships left. And it's your fault that you're losing all of your friends. And when I said, hey, can you please provide evidence for these claims that you're making? Where did Mason declare war against the church? His response to me was, I'll play your quote unquote silly little game. He's trying to make me feel bad to shut me up, right, because I'm challenging the leaders who are defining what he should think and feel, and when that's threatened, what he should do about it.
Yeah. Number 4, promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as B, you're not living up to your potential. C, your family is deficient. Your affiliations are unwise. Your thoughts, feelings, actions are irrelevant or
your
selfish.
Your past is suspect.
Yeah. And then number 5, instill fears, such as fear of thinking independently, the outside world, enemies, losing your salvation, leaving or being shunned by the group or others' disapproval. And I think I want to stop there on that because we'll go further into that later. But just the idea that it is all setting you up to be emotionally manipulated as well. There's one piece of that. So on page 130, Luna quotes Bruce R. McConkie as having said, unless we enjoy the same gifts and work the same miracles that mark the lives of those who have gone before, we are not the Lord's people.
Wait, I'm sorry, where was that?
It's the quote from Bruce R. McConkie on page 130.
Oh, of Recovering Agency?
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
But he says if we don't work the same gifts and have the same miracles that other people before us have, we're not the Lord's people. It's not that. And let me just go into a doctrinal piece here for a second. In the Book of Mormon, in Moroni at the end, I think it's the very last chapter of Moroni, Moroni talks about spiritual gifts, and he lists a whole bunch of them and says that to each person is given a gift. But what Bruce R. McConkie has done is he's basically said, look, if you don't have these gifts, you're not one of the Lord's people. And that's not doctrinal. What he has done is manipulated us into feeling bad or guilty because we're not doing everything that we should be doing. And he's just put us into that. This is the guilt sector. I want you to feel bad about the fact that you're not doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, because that helps me maintain control.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so, I just lost my train of thought. You were talking about what Bruce R. McConkie said here. I think that not only is the church defining your spiritual experiences, they're defining everything within their purview. You know, when you feel uncomfortable, they give that well, here's the reason why. When you feel happy, well, here's the reason why. That your emotion must mean. And so because they're defining it, I like when you were quoting the freedom of mind worksheet, that second page, when you're quoting that, I love that under emotional control number 1, it says that they narrow the range of feelings, and the way that they do that is they define them for you, so that you don't get curious about what that emotion might mean for you.
Right.
Because anger, while a lot of we've all experienced anger, most of us have experienced anger. For me, anger means get your butt in gear. For other people, anger means take a break and back off.
Yeah. Well, and I can't get
uncomfortable. And I can't figure that out if the church tells me that anger means Satan is influencing my life.
The same thing for me. I can't get uncomfortable with these icky things about the church, because the church has taught me that if I'm having discomfort with the teachings of the church, that's Satan involved in my life. I don't get the ability to just sit with it and think about it. They don't want me to do that. They want me to immediately push it aside because they don't want me to look at the uncomfortable things. They lose control as an organization if that's what I do. Sarah's not, as she mentioned before, not feeling real well.
Yeah, before you do that, there's one other thing I wanted to say on the what do you do about it.
I have a couple of things too, but I just want to let us know that we're kind of getting close.
You never shut up.
I know. It's crazy.
So there's a couple of things here. One of the things, Mason, that you said earlier was that cognitive behavioral therapy helps you reframe something so that you feel better about it. That's not exactly...
That's not what I meant.
Accurate.
Go ahead.
We're reframing or challenging your thought distortions to help you come back to a reality-based place, so that the thoughts that you are having will lead to a change in the way you behave so that you function better.
Right.
And it's not meant to be a control. Like if the therapist is telling you, oh, well, this thought means this about you, what we're really going to be asking are things like, how is this thought helping you?
Right.
Could you think about
this? What does this thought mean?
Right. Could you think about this in a different way? So that, could you think about this in a different way that's more truthful? Because, everybody has strengths, everybody has weaknesses. So in the example that Luna gives of I'm so stupid becomes, sometimes I make mistakes, but I can do this. I am so stupid. I might have a client or myself that says, I'm not stupid. I just don't have this knowledge yet, or I don't have enough skills yet. What can I do to gain the skills I need to overcome this journey? Right. It's that we're challenging the extreme thought process so that you can get to a place of action and movement that is healthy and based in tangible things you can hang on to, so that you are no longer stuck in your life. Because when people struggle with these thought distortions, these cognitive distortions, those distortions are making them paralyzed or act in ways that are outside of their morals. And so they tend to struggle with a deep sense of guilt and shame. And our goal is to say, let's bring you back to a place where you are in subjective reality, working towards objective reality. We've got a kiddo right now that is really struggling with a lack of empathy. It's a trauma response. And I've been a counselor for a really long time. And I told you the other night, Mason, I said, I feel like I've failed this kid as his mom because I know how to enforce and work through empathy training, but it's not working for this kiddo.
Right.
It's just not working. And I said, I had to shift from you failed this kid to I have more to learn about how to train or how to help foster empathy development in very young children. And that's more reality-based. I don't work with very young children. I never really have. I've always worked with teenagers and adults. And so my 7-year-old who is struggling, I don't have that skill.
Right.
And by shifting my thoughts of yes, I may be really good at empathy training in teens and adults where you have a more developed frontal cortex. I lack skills in doing that for younglings, obviously, because my kiddo is still struggling despite my best efforts. And that doesn't make me a bad parent, but I was able to then voice to his care team, we need more help because we're not getting this. And he is hurting because of this. Right. If I had stayed in the place of I'm failing this kid as his mother, and I never got to, I need to reach out to somebody where empathy training at a very young age is what is going to be needed right now. And I don't know that skill. I don't have it. It's been years since I've studied young pediatrics because it's not the population that I work with.
Right.
I need somebody else. If I hadn't been able to challenge the cognitive distortion, I would not have been able to enact the appropriate interventions for my son who is in deep struggle right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And recognizing that, it's almost like the sitting in shame. When Brene Brown talks about sitting in shame, shame closes us off. Redefining our reality and where we're at opens us up. It allows us to be accepting of the fact that we're missing tools, but we can learn them. Mm-hmm. Because missing a tool is far different than being unable to use a tool.
Absolutely.
And so, just trying to find that.
So what were those last thoughts that you wanted to share? Because, I'm struggling, y'all. For those of you who can't see me, my brain is starting to throb from staying focused so much in my...
I
can't read a whole lot more. My vision is gone for the day.
I just wanted to... So you talked about this conversation that I had with my brother, and I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on just a couple of pieces of it, but as a background. So I posted this meme. In fact, you posted a meme, and then I shared it. At the top of the meme...
No. You stole it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go.
At the top, it says, leaving a healthy organization looks like this. People saying, see you around. Bye. I love you. Let's get coffee sometime. Everybody's high. They're happy for you, even though you're leaving the organization.
Right. They're celebrating that you're moving on to something that works better for you.
Right. Right. Whatever the reasons are. And then down at the bottom, it says, leaving a cult looks like enjoy outer darkness. You lazy learner. Judas, apostate. You unruly child. Satan is deceiving you. Boo. Everybody's angry that you're leaving. There's no love or happiness for you. It appears that there's no curiosity as to what's going on. So that's what I posted. I would like to point out that I did not say, the meme does not say what organization we're talking about. It simply says leaving a cult.
Yeah, but it can be implied because of the vocabulary. Like outer darkness is definitely a Mormon vocabulary word.
Sure, but it is not specific to Mormonism. I didn't call out Mormonism as a cult. I didn't say, hey, Mormonism, here you go, you're a cult. I simply posted the meme as an opportunity to talk about the fact that this is the experience for some people. Well, my brother immediately latched onto it and basically blamed me for having this experience. Well, the funny thing is it hasn't been my experience. My experience has not been that people are calling me out in general or hating on me or ward members or none of that. In fact, the only real response I've gotten like that is from my brothers.
And your father.
Well, a little bit, but even then, my father hasn't been like that. He disagrees with the choices that I'm making, but he's not attacking my character because of it. He thinks I'm wrong, but he's not attacking my character. He's not demonstrated any less love for me because of it. He just thinks I'm making a bad choice. But one of the couple of things that I wanted to point out is that as he made all these accusations, I called him out on the fact that, again, he's being an asshole about it. He is not being kind to the people that he's talking to. And one of the things that he responded with is, disagreement is rarely pleasant. Okay, fine, but it doesn't have to be antagonistic.
Time for a commercial break. We'll be right back.
It doesn't have to be rude. And so he's justifying the fact that he disagrees with me. Again, it's the ends justify the means. Because I'm trying to save your soul, I can do it however I want to. But the really big one under this was, he says, you contend that I denigrate, which I did. I didn't use the word denigrate, but it's an appropriate word.
Right.
You contend that I denigrate. But the very next thing he says, he doesn't answer that. He says, your meme denigrates an entire group of people claiming we are all cult members. First off, no. Secondly, I didn't claim that we're all cult members. He also goes on and says things like, you call us a fool for paying tithing and all these things. I never said anything like that to anybody on this stream.
Ever. Which is why I said, where's your evidence?
Right.
I mean, my comment to him was, Isaac, provide us with evidence.
Right. And I just want to point out the fact that he is obfuscating what I asked of him. Like, if you disagree with me, and I told him, I don't care if you disagree with me. That's fine. You have the right. I expect you to disagree with me. The issue is the way that you're doing it. And in this case, you contend that I denigrate. He doesn't talk about that at all. He simply says, so do you. It's almost like he's saying, well, I am because you am, kind of a thing. Because you're doing it, I can too. I really just want to, and I guess we can close on this, unless you have something else.
Well, I remembered what we were trying to talk about last week that we had promised our listeners that we would get to.
Okay.
And that was the loading the language. I don't think we did talk about it last week because I just found my note on it. And it was your dad's arguing with you over what the vocabulary word meant. And I felt that would lead into the mystical manipulation. So we need to go ahead and cover that because we made a promise. So go ahead and finish your thought and then we'll jump there.
So I just want to be able to point out the fact that it is the way in which he is seeking to silence the argument. In fact, at this point in time, I blocked him from Facebook.
Well, and you did that for me. You did that at my request because I asked you, and I want to make that abundantly clear because it's not like you to block somebody until you have given them every opportunity possible and it won't work. And I feel like you blocked Isaac a little bit earlier than you would have otherwise because I asked you to, because I've got so much going on that I was like, dude, this is stressing me out. Can you just like end it so we can take a break from the tirades of the tirades of the family? And you honored that for me. And I'm very grateful for that. So I think it's important for our listeners to know that you did it earlier than you normally would. But your reason for doing it was because we're hitting the end of how much bullshit we're willing to take from certain members of the family.
Yeah, well, and I told that is accurate. Everything that you just said is accurate. And I told him, look, I value your opinions, but I'm really tired of listening to your vitriol to get it. And I don't appreciate having my character attacked because you disagree with my ideas.
Or your reality shifted into something, your reality and your intentions are being defined for you, but he's not willing to listen or believe. He doesn't believe you when you say, you're misunderstanding me.
Right. He thinks he knows better what I'm going through than I do, and he has no basis for that assumption. But I just want to point out the fact that this is the kind of thing that happens too often, and it's not just Mormons, and it's not every Mormon, not by any means. I have lots of members who have also reached out and who have disagreed with me, but have done it in much more appropriate ways. I respect that. I respect your disagreement, and I even welcome your disagreement because that's how we get some good conversation out of it.
Because your brother says that since you don't like the way I'm disagreeing with you, you obviously can't take people disagreeing with you. And really what it is you're not willing to put up with being bullied because you have a different opinion or thought process.
It also demonstrates that he's not interested in my opinion. He wants to share, he wants to browbeat me with his opinion, but he's not interested in hearing mine or hearing clarifications of what he thinks that I said. We misunderstand people sometimes. That's not a big deal. But if you're not willing to seek understanding, then I'm not willing to put the effort into the conversation. Well, I blocked him he texted me almost right away and said, really? You can't believe you did this. And then continued on his tirade. And I said, essentially, he did this 3 times. Essentially, he said, or kept going. And I said, look, I'm not having these conversations with you anymore. Mm-hmm. And then he texted again. I said, you asked for a superficial relationship. And the reason was because we can't seem to talk about these things without him being. He
also admitted to being, abrasive. I'm an aggressive person. That's what he said. He said, we both know I'm an aggressive person. And one of the things that my thought was if you know that you're aggressive, then you must know that the way that you are doing this is considered emotionally abusive. Like, that's what your brother does is it fits the diagnostic criteria for emotional abuse and verbal abuse. And he doesn't seem to take any effort in not doing it. It's like, I know I'm abusive, but you just have to deal with it.
Yeah, well, and then the final one, they responded again with something else about trying to browbeat me with his opinion. And I said, look, I don't want to block you here too, but I will. I'm choosing my mental health over everything else. So stop engaging. And then he finally said, okay. That was all he responded was okay. And all I said was thank you after that. But I want to kind of read this again. This is a quote here from Adam Grant that I read very early on in our podcast. I want to read again. That's just the way I am, quote unquote, is a missed opportunity for growth. Personality is not your destiny, it's your tendency. No one is limited to a single way of thinking, feeling, or acting. Who you become is not about the traits you have, it's what you decide to do with them. And the fact that he continually, it feels like an excuse. I'm aggressive, I'm an asshole. It feels like an excuse to not change the way that he does it, to not engage in a different way.
It's actually an admission that he doesn't know how.
Okay, well, and
in my opinion.
Right, and that's why I said it feels like an excuse, because I don't want to claim I understand his motivation. It just feels that way. And so I just wanted to kind of go there. That's just a small little piece of it, but I just wanted to bring out the fact that people are emotionally manipulative in these difficult kinds of conversations. And if we recognize them, we can avoid them, we can protect ourselves from the browbeating. And I think that's all I really wanted to say on that.
So I really appreciate you sharing that, Mason. I think that one of the things that we talk about, but this bridge between thought control and emotional control is defined as loading the language. And the way that I define loading the language, and I'm going to actually look it up here because I know that we made marks in it. So loading the language was 183. The way that I define loading the language is by changing the definition to mean something else. So what Lindsey Corbden says loading the language is each word is an entire package filled with implication, emotion, metaphor, and experience. A high-demand group uses its own complex vocabulary, a mix of invented words and phrases to convey complicated symbolism and doctrines, and existing words which have been redefined either subtly or dramatically. Loaded language serves several purposes. It reframes meanings accepted by greater society, it shuts down critical thinking, and it isolates members, making it difficult for them to communicate with outsiders. And one of the things, Mason, that we had talked about last week was you had started to explain how your dad would not utilize the actual dictionary definitions of certain words as a way to shut down the conversation and avoid an emotional experience. So in this case, your dad basically said, I wouldn't use the word abuse in that situation. And you said, well, what would you call it? And he said, inappropriate. And I don't really necessarily want to go into the specifics of that story because there's a lot of confidential stuff behind.
Right, there's a lot of personal stuff I'm not going to share.
That was behind that. That's not really your story even to share because it's not your story. But I wanted to point out this, and your dad reiterated that. Like, you gave him several examples of what would be accepted in a court of law as abuse, in, any dictionary within the English language as what is abuse. And so we actually looked it up, the word up, and it was to be intentionally cruel in order to cause harm, often a consistent or a repeated behavior would be considered abuse. So it can be singular and it can be a consistent repeated behavior. But my point being, for the purposes of mystical manipulation, is that we do the same thing. We load the language, we change the definition of a word, or we have an, insiders only vocabulary to define certain things that limits the emotional experience you can have. In this case, I believe that your dad could not admit to having been abusive. He claimed his behavior was inappropriate because to admit that he had abused somebody comes with a whole different host of implications, emotions, the reality-based stuff, whereas inappropriate is, it was just a mistake that I've corrected, so I don't need to worry about it anymore. I don't need to address it anymore. And so I think that also occurs when you're trying to mystically manipulate, because we have our whole own set of vocabulary words that defines the existential existence. If I go to a Baptist and I talk to them about the celestial kingdom in heaven, they're going to look at me like I've lost my brain, because it's not a word that they use. It's not a word that most people would use. I would say that the majority of humans who speak English would not know what we're talking about when we talk about the celestial, terrestrial, or telestial.
Right. I certainly wouldn't define it the same way.
Kingdoms in heaven, we have our own vocabulary. And the reason we were going to make that bridge was to talk about how changing the vocabulary influences mystical manipulation. And since we didn't really do that in this episode, I want to make sure that we do talk about it again on the emotional control space, because when we shift, this is part of that thought control and emotional control. They kind of go hand in hand. When we shift the definition, the widely accepted definition of a word, but then an organization or a group changes that definition to mean something else, you are reinforcing the us versus them, the black and white thinking. You're isolating. It's very interesting when you talk to a Mormon within the Mormon belt. We have a different way of speaking. It's one of the reasons why we can travel places and be like, oh, you must be Mormon too. It's the subtleties in the way that we've shifted language and behavior and dress that makes it so easy to pick out another Mormon. And we are told to identify that as, oh, that's the spirit shining in you, that my spirit shining in me recognizes, right? It's the countenance. Oh, what does countenance mean in Mormonism versus what it means in other things? So we kind of missed the mark on following through on that from our last episode, but I would like to definitely cover it again. And so I did write a note right here that when we go into emotional control, we're going to expand a little bit on loading so our next episode is on the introduction to emotional control. And we're going to talk next week about elevated emotion and how our language shifts the feelings that we have and that we're experiencing within the organization.
Right. Well, we did talk about loaded language a little bit last time, so now we talked about it a little bit this time. So I guess you'll just get 3 little blips of loading the language so that we can better understand it. But I agree with one of the things that you said that I really agree with is that it tends to minimize the emotional experience that you can have with someone. Like my dad actually did end up admitting that abuse is probably an appropriate word. It's just not the word he would use. But I feel like the fight to get him to use that word simply minimized our ability to connect emotionally about the experience. I had to fight him to accept the word instead of share with him the emotional experience that I went through or that other people went through in those situations.
Right. And that's what we're going to cover next week when I totally cut you off. The fluorescent lights in here are really hurting my eyes today. I should have brought my sunglasses in so that way they didn't. But
turn them off?
What?
Do you want to turn them off? We don't need them on.
No, we're good. I don't want to talk to you in the dark. That's creepy. I mean, it always leads to other activities when we do that. How about then
we end just with recognizing that as we're become aware of the way that the mystical can be used by organizations to manipulate our reality, we can better avoid those kind of things, whether or not we choose to stay in an organization. And then next time, we'll talk more in depth about loading the language and how that affects the emotional experience that we can have with people. And let's just say today that we're done. We're so glad that you guys could be here. We're so grateful for those of you that are listening and growing from the things that you're learning. It means a lot to us when you reach out to us and tell us that, because we certainly get reached out to by a few people on the other side as well. Gratefully, just a few. It has actually been a mostly positive experience.
Yeah.
We love you guys. Thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, and I apologize. I did not mean to cut off Mason's story. But that is exactly what I did. And so we will make sure, Mason, write yourself a note so that way you can come back to that, because I think the point you were trying to make is valid and very important for our listeners. And I apologize. When you have that optic neuritis, at least for me, the fluorescent lights are just awful. My whole head is pounding. So I'm going to go home, take a nap, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Today's episode was hosted by Sarah and Mason Westbrook, produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. We would love to see you on our Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma Facebook page.
For both my family, Sarah's stepping out. Hey, it's her turn to step out and take care of the kids in the noise.
Yes, they're driving me absolutely insane because my 4 teenagers that are out there are noisier than the 3 toddlers.
Right, for
How
sure.
is that possible? Little brats?
They have bigger vocal cords.
No, the problem is that they have Lee and Coconauer genes in them, so they're noisy little buggers. They also have Trask genes in them.
There's a lot of genes.
And Westbrook
there's some noisy
genes.
ones, yeah.
Both of our families, y'all, are so loud. Whenever we go out and hang out with the Lee, the Lees really aren't as loud as the Trasks are. So let me change that. They have Trask genes, Coconauer genes, and Westbrook genes. And those 3 families, y'all, they noisy. All right. Yes, I had to tell my teenagers to shush. And Katie said, "Sorry, Mom," and continued to giggle hysterically. So I don't really feel the apology in there. And I'm done with the...
Unheard?
I am feeling unheard. And I'm done with the squirrel moment. Mason, I absolutely love...
Oh, I wasn't done.
Oh, I'll shut up. Go. Were you really not done?
No, I wasn't done.
I'm sorry.
I stopped mostly because the door squeaks, and so...
I know, it's the creepy haunted door. Maybe we should go buy that WD-40 we talked about. Go ahead, May. Sorry.
I don't remember exactly what I was getting at, but just the point being that...